Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who indeed are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was younger, before I moved to Hawaii, I grew up in Arizona, and one summer our family took a road trip from Arizona to Southern California. We were coming to stay with relatives who lived in Long Beach, and the big highlight was we're going to go to Knott's Berry Farm. I'd never been there before. I wasn't really big into rides at that time, a little bit scared of them, but I was excited about the log ride. I'd been on log rides before, and I was super excited about it. But that night, the night before, we were in Long Beach, before we headed to Knott's Berry Farm, I had a bad dream. In fact, I would have called it a nightmare, only I couldn't describe what it was. It wasn't any like monsters or creatures or anything. I don't remember doing anything in it. I just remember it being a feeling. And when I woke up, I was terrified. And the best way that I could describe it was sort of like, you know, on the old TVs when there was only like 4 channels that you could watch, and the channels only went up to like midnight or 11:30 p.m., and then once it turned off, you would get this, right? You'd get the snow that was on TV. So it just kind of, to me, it felt like that. But it wasn't just looking at TV snow. It was kind of like there was like a presence, some kind of entity moving in that. And before you start going movie connections on me, this was before 1982, before Poltergeist came out. I was too young to have watched Poltergeist anyway, so that wasn't in the back of my mind. But anyway, as I grew up, maybe once or twice a year, I'd have that same dream, almost every year as I was growing up. And of course, as I got older, it was less terrifying to me, but it was strange that I kept having the dream over and over. And then I want to fast forward a decade and a half or so. I'm now in my mid-20s. I'm going to grad school in Madison, New Jersey at Drew Theological School. I'm studying to become a pastor in the United Methodist Church. It's my 3rd year of studies. And in addition to being a student, I was also working as a student assistant pastor at Madison United Methodist Church, which was the UMC that was right on the corner of the seminary campus. And one day, as the student assistant pastor, I'm out visiting one of our church members and talking with this older woman, and as I had been trained, before I leave, I say, would it be okay if I prayed with you? And she said yes, and held out her hands, and so I held her hands, and as I was praying with her, it happened again. I got that same feeling. This feeling happened while I was praying, but only this time, I wasn't scared. This time it kind of clicked. Oh, this is the presence of God that is with me in this time. And later when I was thinking about it, I realized going back, maybe it wasn't a nightmare that I had in Long Beach at our relative's house the night before Knott's Berry Farm. Maybe it was the presence of God in my life at a young age, and I just didn't know how to process that. Maybe that's why in the Bible, whenever an angel visits someone, the first thing the angel says is do not be afraid, right? There's something overwhelming about being in the presence of God. And so every so often now, I don't have this dream anymore, but I do get that from time to time when I'm praying. Not all the time, of course, just maybe a few times a year. And every time it happens, I acknowledge, wow, there's something special. The presence of God is here even more powerfully than I am normally aware of. And I see that now as a gift and not a curse. Welcome to the 4th week in our current summer series entitled Dreamer. We're looking at the story of Joseph. It's a series that revolves around dreams. From the very get-go in chapter 37 when we started, we're confronted with dreams, and so far almost every week we've had some kind of dream-related connection. Dreams were what first got Joseph in trouble. Actually, more precisely, it was his telling of the dreams and like throwing them in the face of his family. You were all bowing down to me, and the attitude he brought with that kind of got him in trouble. Joseph revisits the realm of dreams when he's in prison in Egypt. He's been cast aside by his brothers. He's been sold to human traffickers who took him to Egypt. He's framed for a crime he didn't commit and thrown in jail. And while he's in jail, the opportunity arises for him to interpret someone else's dreams, two fellow prisoners. And now in today's installment of this early biblical character's life, dreams come up once again. So I invite you to open your Bibles to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. That we have red pew Bibles in the seat back in front of you there. Or if you take out your church app on the home screen, if you scroll down, you'll find something that says Bible. Click on that, and then you click on Read Bible, and it'll open up the YouVersion Bible and take you right to the chapter that we're going to be reading in the New Revised Standard Version. Genesis chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. Now, I want to pause for just a moment before we kind of get too far into today's reading. Joseph has been languishing in prison for at least 2 years. In fact, it's been 2 years since he interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and chief baker. We don't know how long he was in prison before that happened. The cupbearer, after Joseph interpreting his dream, was restored to his position. The baker, unfortunately, lost his head, like literally lost his head. And so 2 years is a long time for Joseph to stay in prison, especially for a crime he didn't commit, right? He was framed for this, and you have to wonder, what did it do to his spirit? How did it impact his mental well-being, his psyche? Was he going to be bitter and resentful, angry at the whole world? First 4 verses. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. And then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows then ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. So the ruler of the most powerful nation in the ancient Near East, Pharaoh of Egypt, has a dream. In fact, it's more like a nightmare. It's a dream that involves a number of cows coming out of the Nile River. There are 7 fat and healthy ones that get eaten by 7 thin and ugly ones. Though I don't think this would cause nightmares if you're watching this sort of cartoon play out. It was probably more something like this. And Pharaoh wakes up and then falls back to sleep again. Verse 5. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. So round 2 of Pharaoh's dreams take him away from the Nile River and into the fields, where there are 14 ears of grain, 7 plump and good, and 7 thin and blighted. It's one of those like similar but different kind of dreams than the first one. He wakes up, most likely in a cold sweat, because we hear in verse 8, in the morning his spirit was troubled. And so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Last week, Pastor John was telling us about the 2 dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, and how Joseph, when he saw them in prison that morning, could immediately tell by their faces that something horrible was bothering them. Well, Pharaoh internalizes it much deeper, and we're told that it was manifest in his spirit, right? Presumably because as one of the power shakers in that part of the ancient Near East, his dreams would affect not just himself, but his entire nation. And so, in desperation, he calls out to his most experienced wise men, and NRSV says magicians, to come and interpret to him what his dream means. But unfortunately, just like with the baker and the cupbearer, nobody could interpret what the dreams were. Michael Williams, in his Storyteller's Companion to the Bible for the book of Genesis, remarks that Jewish rabbis over the ages, have commented and offered their own interpretations of what they think Pharaoh's advisors might have suggested. In fact, one said the dreams, the Egyptian magician said the dreams meant Pharaoh was going to have 7 daughters, but that all 7 daughters would die. Another said, no, it means you're going to conquer 7 new regions of the world, but then all of those regions would rebel against you. Of course, Pharaoh didn't consider any of them to be legitimate. Meyer Stenbergs is an Israelite biblical scholar who teaches at Tel Aviv University, and in his book, The Poetics of Biblical Narrative, makes this really powerful distinction about dreams for us versus dreams in biblical times. He says, in contemporary Western cultures, dreams are often understood to be revelations of the unconscious, right? So it's the dreamer's personal inner life that starts making itself to the surface of our consciousness during our REM sleep, or our rapid eye movement portion of our sleeping time. And since the development of modern psychological studies, dreams have been interpreted as the emergence of our inner desires or our woundedness or other emotional phenomena that maybe we haven't quite made our peace yet with. We haven't been bringing it to conscious life. So according to this way of thinking, dreams enable the individual to discover their inner world with more awareness, and perhaps for those of us that are religious, then to encounter God as we go through these discoveries. But he says dreams in Genesis do not have that same connection. They're not about individuals. They are predictive in the level of narrative. In fact, they're literary devices that foreshadow future events. They concern revelations from God that will affect the entire community, or in this case, the entire ancient Near East. And many cultures today still see dreams in this same understanding, that dreams provide access to God, and they might even be predictive of future events. It's not just for you and your own life to work out, but it involves the larger community. Now, we need to talk about the Nile River before we get into the dream and its interpretation. In the ancient Near East, the Nile was essential to life. In fact, Walter Brueggemann is, in his commentary in the interpretation series, says it's more, whenever you hear about the Nile in the Bible, it's more than just a geographical reference. It's the expression of Pharaoh's power of fertility. The governance of the Nile, it's what permits Pharaoh to extend life and health and to guarantee prosperity to his community. And so if the Nile is a part of something that's going to bring failure, then that means somehow Pharaoh maybe doesn't have control over life and death like he presumes to say. In fact, when we go to the next book of the Bible, Exodus, and there's Moses, and before the 10 Commandments come out, there's the whole 10 plagues in Egypt. That's why the fouling of the Nile is so significant, so crucial, because that was the source of life and health to the community. And so this dream, any dream that has the Nile as a source of death, it literally strikes at the heart of Pharaoh's ability to be the author and finisher of life like he claims. Verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. And we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. And there was this young Hebrew there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. And when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out to be. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So Joseph, the forgotten one, left to languish in prison for 2+ years, is finally remembered, and we might say at just the right time. The cupbearer remembers this young Hebrew prisoner who once gave him peace of mind by interpreting his dream, and he says to his boss, as Pastor John mentioned, the cupbearer would have been part of the cabinet of the Pharaoh. Hey, boss, maybe he can help you too. Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not I, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Joseph has another costume change, something that he seems to keep doing, him in clothing, throughout each chapter of this story. In fact, every time garments are mentioned in the Joseph story, it's a sign that something significant is about to take place. From when he is given his jacket, his coat of many colors, his coat with long sleeves, to when it is removed from him by his brothers, when he is given the servant's outfit in Egypt, when he's sent into prison, and now with Pharaoh as well. Before meeting with Pharaoh, Joe decides to have a quick shower, shave, and a fresh set of clothes, because I'm guessing he gets pretty stinky in prison for being there for a couple of years. And when he's finally standing before the king, Pharaoh says, "So I heard you have quite the reputation." And at maybe a few chapters back, or at least when we started our story, Joseph would have been like, "Yeah, you've heard right. Like, I am the man about dreams. Let me tell you, I've had so many dreams," and most of the time people don't listen to me, but you are wise to listen to me. That's how he might have responded back in the beginning. But no, what does he say this time? Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not I, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And you know how I was asking, what would spending 2 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit, what would that do to your spirit? Evidently, he's not bitter, but this has allowed Joseph a chance to mature and to maybe reflect. In fact, in the first couple chapters, he never once mentioned God, not at all. It wasn't until he was thrown in prison that he first mentions God's name. That's what Pastor John shared with us last week. And now, instead of tooting his own horn and talking about what a great dream interpreter he is, he redirects Pharaoh to God. Michael Williams also notes that the phrase that the NRSV translates as "God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer" can also be literally translated in Hebrew, "God will answer shalom to Pharaoh." Shalom. You may remember when we first started the story in chapter 37, Joseph's brothers, the narrator said, could not speak shalom to him. They could not say words of peace. They hated him. But now God is offering shalom to Pharaoh through Joseph's interpretations. And the word shalom can have many meanings in this location. Michael Williams says it could mean complete, whole, sound, or peaceful. And it often has a sense of a reward. And so God is going to provide all of that as a reward to Pharaoh. That shalom will extend beyond just his own spirit that morning, but to the larger Egypt and even on to the ancient Near East as a whole. Now, in verses 17 to 24, Pharaoh then tells Joseph about his dreams. And it's almost word for word what we heard earlier, though he adds a couple extra descriptors in describing it, leading to more of the fear and the danger, bringing that up of the impact it's had on him. And it's clear that the Pharaoh senses there's some enormous catastrophe that is looming. He just doesn't know what it is, and he needs Joseph's help. Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. Those are both 7 years of famine. It is, as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt, and after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about." Isn't it interesting how Pharaoh's own wise men and magicians had no clue what this dream meant, and as soon as he hears it, Joseph knows exactly what the interpretation is, right? He didn't need to think things over at all. God blessed him with that. Now, you've heard me say it before, but numbers often mean more than just the number when they're revealed in the Bible. 7 means a long, undetermined period of time, sort of like a fullness of events. It could be for good or for bad. And the fact that there are 2 separate dreams where there are double 7s doesn't mean that it's going to be 28 of something. No, Joseph said that doubling means that God has fixed what's about to take place, meaning it is definitely going to come about. There will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of a severe and crippling famine. And God has ordained that this would take place, which means Pharaoh doesn't get to decide what happens even in his own kingdom. It is out of his hands. And then Joseph takes it a step further Verse 33. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. And the food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. As Kathleen O'Connor puts it in her commentary, Joseph, the ex-convict, has the chutzpah to offer a plan to Pharaoh for managing the coming global cataclysm. He encourages the selection of a famine czar, if you will, a wise and discerning man who will have authority over all of Egypt. And if you're a fan of The Voice and Blake Shelton, I could just see him going like this, right? It's me, pick me. Pick me. We know who Joseph has in mind, even though he doesn't explicitly say it. And just like Potiphar and the prison warden, Pharaoh appoints Joseph to a place of high authority, second only to himself. Verse 39. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And so once again, the kid comes out of the pit, we might say, smelling like a rose once again. Why? We're told, remember, at the very beginning of chapter 37, that the hand of the Lord was upon him. Over and over we get that. The hand of the Lord was upon Joseph. And here in Egypt, there's no exception. Verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. And removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put on a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh gives Joseph all the symbols of Egyptian power. The king's own signet ring, which can make laws on behalf of the king. New royal garments. Here's another clothing change, indicating another significant event happening in the story. Golden chains around his neck instead of the iron ones that he had around his ankles when he was in prison. He gets his own Uber chariot to take him wherever he wants to go, and all must bend the knee whenever he passes by. Not a bad gig if you can get it, right? And to top things off, Pharaoh gives Joseph 2 more items that will solidify his status as an honorary Egyptian. First, he gives him an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. Cordy, it's not too late. You can name your child Zaphanath-Paneah on Wednesday. Just think about it. He also gives Joseph an Egyptian wife, a highborn daughter of the priest of On, a woman who's named Asenath. And the narrator tells us Joseph is now 30 years old when he becomes second in command to Pharaoh. And as those 7 years of abundance begin, he starts taking his Uber chariot all around Egypt and making sure that they have the system set in place to take a portion of the abundance that is grown so that they will have that reserve for when the famine comes. And we discover it's also a period of abundance for Joseph personally. Verse 50. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And the second he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortune. So 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. If those names are familiar to you, those are 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Along with Joseph's brothers, we will hear those names over and over again as Israel goes throughout its history. But biblical scholar Robert Alter says, even though the narrator says that Manasseh means that God has made me forget my hardship and my father's house, he says, can you ever really forget the family you grew up in? I mean, even those worst moments of your upbringing? Instead, another way that the Hebrew can be translated is that God has released me from all the debt of my hardship. Meaning that God has forgiven whatever personal character flaws Joseph had that led to his painful past, and that all of that has been forgiven, and he's freed from that emotional and spiritual imprisonment as he kept thinking about his past. Now he's set free, sort of like given a new lease on life, if you will. I kind of like that. As chapter 41 draws to a close, Joseph has successfully accomplished what he said Pharaoh should do when he first interpreted Pharaoh's dream to him. He's collected enough resources not only to take care of the people of Egypt for those 7 years of drought, but he's also accumulated a little bit more so that those in surrounding countries could also come and buy food from Egypt. Verse 57 says this, "Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine became severe throughout the world." And so the stage is set for something epic to take place. If all the world is coming to Egypt, then you would imagine maybe that might include his brothers and his father when they get hungry. That's next week, though. In the meantime, I just want to leave us with one insight. As I was thinking about and reflecting on this specific chapter of the Joseph saga, who was it again that God chose to answer shalom to in the story? It was Pharaoh, right? It wasn't Joseph, the faithful Hebrew. It was Pharaoh, the Egyptian leader, the follower of a completely different religion than Judaism. Nevertheless, God chose him through which to bring a divine blessing into the world through Joseph's interpretation. This non-worshiper of God is tasked with a dream that would bring life to the ancient Near East. And it kind of makes me stop and wonder, especially when I'm sure good-meaning people of faith say, you don't want to have anything to do with those Muslims or those Hindus or whatever, that we only have the truth. Maybe there's something to be said for connecting with people of other faith, that they might have something to learn from us just as we might have something to learn from them. Because I think one of the deep biblical truths that you'll find over and over throughout Scripture is that the God we serve, the creator of the heavens and the earth, the author and finisher of all life, is a God of everyone. And that God chooses to bless everyone, not just the chosen people of Israel. Through Joseph and Pharaoh, the entire ancient Near East will survive this cataclysmic famine. And if you go back even further, when God made the covenant first with Abraham and said, I'm going to make you the father of a great nation, and I'm going to bless you so that you will be a blessing to others. That God had this idea from the very beginning that we are to be a blessing to the whole world. Even us today as followers of Jesus. Not just to those who worship the same God as we, not just to those in our same denomination or our same faith, but to everyone. Even people who ridicule our faith. It doesn't matter. God's blessings are meant for everyone. We say every week at Palmdale United Methodist Church, we are inspired by Jesus to love. And you know that means loving more than just those people that come into the sanctuary or connect with us online, right? That means everyone. That's what Pharaoh's learning. That's what Joseph is learning. We have an opportunity. We have a responsibility to reach out to people of all walks of life, to love them, to pray for them, and to be a blessing in their lives. And yes, it may be a bit scary. We may not understand it and may not even know what we're supposed to be doing. But that television snow feeling that kind of scares us from time to time just might turn out to be the presence of God in our lives in a real and powerful way, seeking to bring life and abundance not just to us, but to the entire world. So from pit to palace, that's where Joseph has come in just a few short chapters, but the story is just tuning up. And it's going to get really interesting over the final 2 weeks. I hope that you will be back here in person or online as we finish the story of Dreamer, the story of Joseph. Amen.